Hello, and welcome back to Learning BC Development from Scratch. This is episode 3, and in this episode, we will be covering chapter 3 of the AL for Beginners workbook. And I originally recorded this morning, did a live stream, recorded it, and I ran into several problems, and it was kind of a disorganized mess. So I am redoing it from scratch based on what I learned the first time, my mistake, the lesson I learned from that mistake and what caused it, and some feedback from a few people who emailed me throughout the day, kindly offering some words of advice on how to fix the problems and mistakes that I made. So thank you for your patience and your graciousness in sharing that information with me. So let's get started. I'm Steve Endo. I am on, Twitter. There's my blog, and then YouTube and Twitch, of course. So what do we have here? So if you've been following this series, this Learning BC Development from Scratch is based off of the AL for Beginners workbook by Christoph. And you can find him on Twitter at mynavblog.com, at mynavblog. And he does have a blog, I believe, mynavblog.com. And this workbook is on GitHub for free. Now, this version that I'm working from is one that I believe was originally published in November, December 2019. I just received an email from Christoph that he's going to make some minor updates to reflect some changes in best practices and methodology related to things like file naming. Not super critical to working through the lesson, but I am going to be looking for that updated version when he makes those changes, and subsequent episodes I will use that new version. But with that, so this particular chapter 3 in this lesson, it's about some configuration changes and updates you'll want to make to the settings in Visual Studio Code when you create a new AL project. And some of those settings you'll want to, the values you'll want to set based on what type of project you're using. But in general, you'll get the concept and you'll see what the settings are, and you'll just need to remember to change them. Now, the one challenge I have had with this topic, it seems really simple. Oh, here's a setting, set it to this value. Well, that's great if you have 1 or 2 or 3 settings, but when you have to remember 10 or 15 or 20 different little things, when you're new to this, it can be confusing and a bit overwhelming, and I don't remember which 20 items I need to change. I have to have a list so I can work through. Now, for the experienced Nav or BC developers, you'll see them, oh, you just make these 10 changes. What's the big deal? Well, I'm not there yet. So they can do this in their sleep. I can't. I need a list. So I literally need to have a list so I can go down the list. And maybe one day in 6 months or 12 months, I'll just remember, oh, I need to do these things, and no big deal. It would be great if many of these things were included in the ALGO project template, like just the translation file configuration option. That would be great if that's a common or mandatory thing. But these settings apparently kind of optional, and they're not currently included in the ALGO template. So with that, this list of project settings I've essentially already covered. So in the prior episode, I talked about installing the AL language extension. So that one's pretty straightforward. I just covered the one extension, but in the workbook, he does mention some other extensions. And then Waldo has the AL language extension pack, which is his group or collection of extensions that he likes to use. So that's a convenient way to install a bunch of extensions. But just know that you will want to have extensions installed, minimum of 1, but you could have 5, 6, 7 if you want, to help support and facilitate your AL development. Next, you know about AL Go. Not so much a setting, but just pressing F1 or Control-Shift-P in order to use that drop-down menu, that action menu, and choose AL Go. Then I talked about modifying the launch.json file to specify your server URL, and I'll do that again today. Then you need to download symbols from your BC Docker container or your online sandbox. Then you need to modify the app.json. You need to set the app name, publisher, ID ranges, features like translation file, and then if you have URLs for your EULA, privacy statement, support, contact information. So you see, these are all minor things individually, but it starts to add up. Now, I think someone said, well, I don't usually create new AL projects every single day. Makes total sense. You set up this new project and it's a 6-month endeavor or 3-month or whatever it is. And maybe you have 2 or 3 projects ongoing. So it's not that big a deal. You don't have to do it often. While I'm learning though, I will set up a new AL project every single time. I'll just start from scratch. So I'm forcing myself to learn it. And when I do that, you start to realize how many steps are in this process. It's like, oh, I need to do that. Wait, there's that. And over a dozen, you realize it starts to get involved. So this I've already covered. So next step is what we'll talk about today, configuring code analyzers. This is in chapter 3, creating an appsourcecop JSON file and a mandatory affixes setting. And then optionally you can enable Git and use a git ignore file. And I'll probably exclude the Git discussion, and as I mentioned before, I'll make that a separate discussion because Git is its own animal on its own. So with that, let's take a look at chapter 3, and here we go. Okay, so the stream is looking good, and okay, so here I have my, where's my mouse? My Docker server where I have my business, it's a dedicated machine where I have my Business Central Docker containers. And here's chapter 3 of the AL for Beginners workbook. So let's start to work through that, and I'll perform every step of the process. And now that I know what I did wrong last time, I will point out that mistake because it was confusing me at first, and then I got stuck. So I'm assuming I'm not the only person on the planet. So before I get started with that, let me just set up a new project. I'll press F1, type ALGO, and press enter, and AL project 6, target platform 5.0, and local server, username, password, and I see interesting. Wow. Brand new project. I'm already getting errors. Okay. So let me just see if I can resolve this without starting all over again. Okay. Let me see if I can figure out why. File, preferences, settings. I think I know why. User, extensions. Yeah, there we go. Okay, let me just clean this up. Let's just pretend none of that happened, okay? So let me go back, and it's because I'd already enabled the stuff for the workbook. I have to roll that back. So let me close this editor, close folder, sorry. Okay, pretend that never happened. F1, ALGO, project 7, 5.0, and we're going to choose our own server, and it did not ask us to authenticate. I'm going to change my server URL to test because that's the name of my container on my server, and we change this from BC 160 to just BC. And then I don't think I have to change anything in the app.json, so I'm just going to leave it as is for now. Okay, so we are all set up. We have our, let me download symbols first. So I'm going to press F1, select download symbols, and symbols have been downloaded. I did not run into the hostname not found error. Okay, so we are ready. So what are we going to do in chapter 3? And let me see if I can make this bigger on screen. And let's see what that looks like. Oops. Okay, I think that's reasonably large. One moment, let me fix a light here. Okay, almost had a light drop on my head. So there we go. So now we have our objectives here. We are going to, we are going to get familiar with the extension overview. So this is an introduction of a project that he's proposing as a sample project, like a lab or a lesson where we're going to build a new extension and enable the code analysis tool. That's kind of the main focus of this. And then there's an option called the affixes and mandatory affixes, and I'll explain what that means. And then he introduces object naming best practices. And he emailed me and let me know that these best practices he's discussing in this original version of the workbook have been superseded by a slightly different set of practices. Not so much the object naming, but more, it sounds like the folder organization. And I'll just double check his email before I explain that. But just the concept of there are some best practices that they're recommending for object naming of AL objects. So with that, let's get started. So the background is this is a extension project called the bonus registration extension. So they're starting a new project, this registration extension for BC, and your management decided that you are the lucky developer who gets to work on it. Very cool. We are lucky. So they want to have the extension published on AppSource, and that is a critical distinction. You can have an AppSource extension that gets publicly registered on the Microsoft AppSource for anyone to use, or you can have it as a per tenant extension that you deliver to a customer and install only on their extension. So in this case, we're going for AppSource. And the extension should have these features, and you can review those. These will come into play in subsequent lessons. So I'm just going to skip through those because they're not, these features are not relevant immediately for Chapter 3. Okay, so in order to do that, we want to enable the code analysis tool. And the code analysis tool, those are rules that help catch errors, mistakes, non-best practices. There's a term for some of these things you want to avoid, problem areas. So the code analysis tools automatically look at your code, even pre-compile, and they warn you of errors. So just kind of like IntelliSense or whatever you might call it in Visual Studio, the red squiggly lines. Back in the day in Visual Studio, I believe it was called Roslyn analyzers. And my understanding is with Visual Studio and C#, those just got incorporated into, I don't know if it was Visual Studio or .NET or C#, whatever. It just, I didn't have to install Roslyn separately anymore. And it seems like those just automatically occur. So those are pretty handy. So they have the same thing for AL built into, I think, the AL language extension. I'm not exactly sure where it lives, but I'm assuming it is in the AL language extension because it is AL specific. So what do we have here? We have CodeCop, AppSourceCop, UICop, and per tenant extension cop. These are 4 different code analysis tools that you can enable in your Business Central AL projects. And they will catch things that aren't necessarily obvious, like, hey, you should really put a space before and after your assignment operator. And I'll show you some of those are deprecated or no longer relevant. They're anachronisms because now I'm seeing Visual Studio Code is automatically formatting stuff. As soon as I hit space, it reformats those mistakes out. So I don't even get the code analysis error. I can't even force it to occur. So some of the simple examples don't even work anymore because you can't even trigger the error. But other things you'll see can trigger errors or warnings in your code pre-compilation or during compilation. CodeCop, I believe, is just the general code analyzer that gives you some best practices, syntax errors, and language errors. appsourcecop warns you about things that are required to publish an app source. So for this parameter setting, you'll need a full URL. You can't leave it blank. UI cop, I'm assuming, is for user interface elements. I haven't yet gotten to the UI page, list page, cards, whatever they're called in BC. So I haven't encountered the the UI cop errors yet. And then there's per tenant extension cop. And my guess, and based on the problem I experienced this morning, the per tenant extension is an alternative to appsourcecop. So based on what I saw this morning, you either want to have appsourcecop or per tenant extension cop. I don't think you want to enable both because they have conflicting rule sets that aren't compatible. So if you're going to go with appsourcecop, great. Otherwise, you can go with per tenant cop. I don't think you want to have both, but we can test that and see what happens. But I'll show you why I don't think you want both. So to enable code analysis, open settings.json. Now, this is one thing that I did initially when I did this workbook a while back, and there's something else behind the scenes that I'll point out that wasn't obvious to me at all. And later, people I think it was on Twitter, pointed this out to me, and I learned about it subsequently. And I think it's a pretty big deal. You really want to know about it and think about how you want to set up your two different settings JSON file. And I've received an email today with further advice based on their preference. And I kind of agree with that because you'll see the consequence of doing it one way if you're not careful. So we're going to enable code analysis, so one or more of our code cops, in the settings.json file. Now, unfortunately, this isn't just a simple UI check a box or install an extension. You actually have to edit the JSON, but fortunately, it is very simple. So you can do it from either the File Preferences Settings menu or by writing in the command palette open settings JSON. So let's try both. So if I want to go to File, Preferences, Settings menu, now one thing I didn't realize is notice there is a user or there is a workspace. Big difference between these two. I'm going to start with user, and the distinction is the user settings JSON is for all projects that you do under your user account. The workspace settings are workspace specific or project specific in Visual Studio Code. So if you have project A and project B, you could have appsourcecop enabled for project A, and you could have per tenant extension cop enabled for project B. And to do that, you would use the workspace settings.json file. That is an important lesson that took me a while to learn, so be aware of that. So I'm going to start with user settings. So I'm going to, under the settings tab here, user, and you want to navigate to extensions in this list. And now earlier, I had Visual Studio collapse like this, VS Code. I didn't see this, and I was wondering, wait, where do I navigate? I spent a couple minutes trying to figure out where to navigate. Well, the reason was when you make it narrow like this, it collapses those pages or that table of contents. So you can collapse your Explore menu here. Notice it comes back. So you'll want to make VS Code wider so that you see this list of pages here. So if you have this expanded or you show your extensions or whatever, you'll want to make this wide enough so that you see that commonly used pane. Now you could scroll through here page after page after page, but there's a lot of options. So I'd really recommend making sure it's wide enough to see these commonly used shortcuts. So let me collapse my Explorer and let's go to extensions. Let's expand extensions. Click on the first one, which is AL language extension. And I don't think I can make this wider here. So here we have AL language configuration. And there we go, AL language extension configuration. You'll scroll down, you'll see some options, which I'll ignore for now. I'm sure they're important, but I haven't gotten to them yet. The section we want is code analyzers. So sets the list of paths to code analyzers to use for performing code analysis. Excellent. Edit in settings.json. Simple, right? Settings.json. Well, as we learned, this is the user settings.json, not the workspace settings.json, and I'll go into that further. So let's click on edit in settings.json, which is our user settings.json. Very cool. It opens the settings file, automatically adds in the al.codeanalyzer setting and puts it in brackets for our JSON array, automatically drops down the IntelliSense showing us which options we need to type. So it's super easy as long as you know it's something you need to do. You need to remember it, or like, oh yeah, I need to enable code analyzers on my new project. Great. That's why I need a checklist. Not because it's hard, but because I'll forget. So let's see what he wants us to enable. So File, Preferences, Settings, AL language extensions, and this is the user settings, I'm assuming. You can't really tell in the screenshot, but let's assume it's user settings. Then code analyzers, edit in settings, JSON. First one is enable code analysis. Well, the current AL language extension adds this in. We don't have to type anything. Cool. So we need to add al.enable code analysis true, and AL code analyzers. He wants us to add appsourcecop and codecop, because remember, our example extension here our employer wants to publish this in AppSource. Great. So let's do this first. So let me hit enter and do the quotation mark in case this dropdown isn't there. AppSourcecop and codecop. So we then do a comma, quotation mark, codecop, enter. So it's that easy. If you know which ones you need to do, you pop right in here, you click, comma, click, you're done. Now, we do need to add one setting manually. So let's do al.code, what's it called? Enable code analysis. Okay. Quote. Okay, so IntelliSense is a little flaky if you make a mistake. So I'll just delete it, quotation mark, al.enable code analysis. Great, so we're going to click that one there. And we want true because we do want to turn this on. I save that settings.json, Control S. Perfect. Okay, for the extensions that are developed for AppSource, appsourcecop is mandatory. However, it's always good to have codecop turned on because it shows the general AL guidelines for code. Perfect, on board with that. And here he provides a link to what is checked for appsourcecop. So he provides a URL to this Microsoft page. And this is an example of, this is the general chapter using the code analysis tool, and then appsourcecop analyzer rules, and it lists the specific rule numbers and what they mean. And then here's the codecop analyzer rules. So if you ever have any question about what AA0001 means, you can look it up on here. So pretty straightforward, and they're usually pretty obvious. Okay, so then we're done with enabling our code analyzers. That's it. Next, he says affixes, and each new object that you develop for BC needs to have its own prefix or suffix when you name the object. And the concept is, if you're creating an object for a customer or a tenant and they're using 10 ISV solutions that are also BC extensions, if we're both modifying the customer list and we're doing a customer list extension, what if I call mine customer list ext and someone else calls theirs customer list ext? It's not unique, so BC has a conflict there. So we want to name our objects uniquely so that BC can load them up, have a list of them, and know that they're all distinct and we don't have any conflict. Perfect. Okay, so it is mandatory to avoid object naming conflicts. If you extend standard objects such as a page or table for each field, control, or action, you need to add the prefix or suffix. So not just the page object or the page extension object, but when you're working with BC stuff, you need to add your prefix or suffix to the page, table, field, control, action, etc., just so that everything you do has your unique prefix or suffix. So the general rule is that the affix should contain at least 3 characters. So he shows an example, MNB, which I now know, it didn't occur to me before, it means my nav blog. Obvious, right? Duh. So that's my brain dead moment. I didn't realize what this meant. He explained my nav blog. So it should contain at least 3 characters, and the appsourcecop code analyzer will warn you about this if you don't do it, and we'll see that shortly. So let me adjust some AC here. Okay. To enable the checking of affixes, create a file in your project, appsourcecop.json. Again, one more thing you have to do manually. So let's go and do that over here in Visual Studio. So I'm going to show my Files Explorer pane. I am going to do, I don't know if there's a better way to do this, but I'll just right-click in this pane. I don't yet know the shortcut. Let's see if we have something. Press F1, AL File. No, AL Page. Okay, so I'll look into whether there's a better shortcut, but I'm just going to right-click and choose New File. It's easy enough. We want to call this appsourcecop.json. Great. So I put this in the root of the application. I don't know if this is better moved in the VS Code folder or a different place, but I believe it'll work fine in this root. Okay, so appsourcecop.json, and we need to have open braces, mandatory affixes, and then our suffix. So I'm just going to paste that in here. Mandatory affixes, and instead of MNB, I will do LBC. And that's not Long Beach, that is Learning Business Central. How's that? So LBC will be my affix. Okay. So now when you try to publish using Control F5, the extension one more time, you should see an error similar to this below. And this is what I could not get working this morning, and I'll demonstrate why. I was a little too eager. Okay, so let's save this, Control F5. Okay, excellent. We actually got an error. So let me just scoot that up. Okay, so error. Okay, so we're getting several errors, which is good. We are getting the code analysis errors. These are listed here. So AS0051, the manifest property brief must be specified and contain a meaningful value. We'll look that up, and I don't know what that means yet. We have several of these. They relate to app.json. Okay, I now know what that is. The AS00015 or 0015, the translation file flag must be added to the features array in the app.json file. We know what that is from the prior lesson where I added in the translation file property manually. It would be great if that was just added in the ALGO template, but here we are with some manual steps. Okay, so the property must be valid URL. Great. Now here's what we really care about. AS0011, the identifier customer list ext must have at least one of the mandatory affixes LBC. Well, look at that. We said that we have a mandatory requirement that we have affixes of LBC. That's our abbreviation. And how do we come up with that? Well, the affix you use in your project must be registered by or with Microsoft. Otherwise, you could have a conflict with another company. So if I use LBC and maybe there's Long Beach Development Corporation and they use LBC in their development projects, we would have a conflict. So I can't just make this up. I need to email d365val@microsoft.com, which I haven't done yet. I need to do that to see if that's still valid and go through that process and see what it's like. I don't know if I choose and send them a list or if they assign that. So it takes around 1 or 2 business days to register. Great. Okay, so now It says that customer list ext must have at least one of the mandatory suffixes. Okay, how do I fix that? So I see that this is in red, app.json. So I have 8 problems with this file, it looks like. And you see those are now squiggly red underlined. I also have hello world AL has 2 errors now. Let me scroll down. I don't know why it says 2. Okay, so it talks about the affixes and it has an incorrect name. Great, so that gets to a later point in chapter 3 that tells us about naming conventions. So our code, I already forgotten the name, our code analysis tools are warning us not only of mistakes we made essentially because we made the affix mandatory, but it's also telling us about best practices related to file naming conventions. Great, so let's fix that. Let's start with the affix. So if we hover over this underlined customer list ext, must have at least one of the mandatory affixes LBC. And my understanding is that can be a prefix or suffix. And I don't know if that's a preference thing, but let's go with a prefix. So I'm going to do LBC, customer list ext. I'm going to hit save. Now if I hover over this, okay, so our affix error just went away. We now only have one error. Our hello world.al is highlighted in yellow and it shows 1, and it looks like that's an error count, or warning count at least. So now we have page extension error. The file hello world.al has an incorrect name. Great. The valid name is customer list ext.pageext.al. How does it know that? Well, let's go down and take a look. File naming in chapter 3, Christoph is way ahead of us. In the AL language, one of the practices is to create one file per object. In theory, you can have more than one file per object, but you try to just keep it simple with one file per object with AL. And in the .NET world, say C#, similar concept. If you're doing a good job, you could have one class or one CS file per object. There are certain reasons why you'll combine objects, overloading, things like that, inheritance, but in general, it keeps it easier if you have separate CS files per object. So the file name can be created as object name excluding prefix. So we don't include our LBC, our affix, as a prefix or suffix in that file name. One moment. Dot object type name. In this case, we are doing a page extension because we're extending the customer list page, taking a base BC object and we're just enhancing it or adding something on top of it. .al. So object name excluding prefix, object type name, .al. Now, how do we know it's page ext? Well, he provides some samples of common objects. So in this case, we have a page extension and the object type will be page ext. Cool. So let's rename this. So it says the valid name is customer list ext, page ext, al. So let's rename. I'm going to go this way. I'm going to right click on my object, hello world al, choose rename. You can press F2. So let's try that. Highlight F2 and it should be customer list, was it page ext? I've already forgotten. Customer list page ext el. Oh, customer list ext. Got it. I have short-term memory. Okay, loss. There we go. So now we have customer list ext.pageext.al. And I don't think this has any, this isn't like a compiler problem. This isn't a code problem. This is just a naming convention to keep things consistent and organized, which is kind of nice. If you've inherited a project, you've probably seen some crazy naming conventions that make no sense. So I think it's good to have it standard. It's not about like right or wrong or perfect. It's just like, hey, let's agree on this. Cool. So Now you notice I don't have any errors here, but my app.json does. So let's clean those up. Brief. And brief is, highlight over it, manifest property must be specified contain a meaningful value. So this is my super duper BC extension. Description. Meaningful value. It's so good you won't believe it. Privacy statement. Now this I happen to know needs to be a URL, pretty sure. So I'm going to call this https my.company.com/privacy. Okay. And I'm just going to copy that base URL. EULA can be company.com/EULA. Help/help. URL, just company, logo. Let's see if it takes this. Logo.jpg. Okay. So now I'll save. And once I hit save, the code analysis tool runs and it validates right away. Now I do see one squiggly left up at the top. So there's one more that we saw in the compile errors. And it's kind of at the bottom down here. If I hover over this, the translation file flag must be added to the features array. Great. So I've forgotten how to do that already. Features, translation file. Let me look for that. So I need to do this a few dozen times before I'll come close to remembering this. And this is the one problem with the manual configuration you have to do. It's like I don't think there's any value for me adding this configuration option. If it's required, then just include it automatically. Okay, Azure DevOps, first extension, and there it is. Features, translation file. Okay, so that's all we need to do is just have that there. So we'll now save that. Translation file, features, translation file. Okay, interestingly, we fixed the features, translation file. Now it complains about our logo, and it says it cannot be found. So let's give this a try. I'm going to go to my blog, blog.steveendo.com. And I'm going to right-click on this Business Central logo, and here I'm going to copy the image address. Let's see if it accepts a URL here. Save that. Oops. Save that. Okay. So I think it may want a local file. Now, let me just do Control F5 to see if we can get more information. So, okay. So let me just save this image as. Do downloads, BC logo 2020 to PNG, and okay, let's replace this logo with this BC logo 2020.png. Okay, it doesn't like this. Gonna guess on our escape character here. Look at that. So apparently the logo needs to be a local file path to an acceptable logo file. I'm going to have to look into what the acceptable logo types, file formats, image formats, size, path parameters, etc. Now I'm assuming the best place to put that is in your project directory, but I just use downloads, for example. Actually, let's just try that while we're here. Let me copy this, go into Documents, AL, Project 7. Let me just paste it here. Let me see if I can get rid of this. See if we can use a relative path reference. Cool. Okay, kind of nice. So if you drop that PNG in your project, we can have it right there without a path. Kind of nice. Now let's try this. Let's create a new folder called images, lowercase images, just to be consistent. And let's drag our BC logo into images. Now, if I save, my logo breaks because I don't have the path. Let's try a relative path. ./images/save. Very cool. So, great. I'm going to create an images folder locally. I'll put my images in that folder within that project subdirectory, and then I'll use a relative path rather than a full hard-coded path, an absolute path for that image. Perfect. It's not complaining about PNG, but I need to look up, see what the specifications are and requirements for that logo. I'm guessing it shows up in AppSource, and that's kind of one of the purposes. It might also show up in the BC extensions list, but I just want to check. Very cool. So we are making very good progress. And what else do we have here? Okay, let me go back to our code analysis tools. What page? Okay, let's get past this. Okay, so we did code analysis tools. We did the AL language extension configuration in the user settings file. Okay. And we got appsourcecop to work because it was complaining about our missing affix, or in this case, a prefix of LBC customer list extension. And if we choose the wrong one, let's do LBD, save that, it complains. So it has to be just LBC, perfect. And affixes, mandatory, and file naming, we covered that, and chapter summary. Now, great, you could say, great, we just finished this, I'm done. Well, let's go back to the things I pointed out earlier. Specifically, let me close these. If I go into File, Preferences, Settings, and remember, I only see these commonly used pages if my window's wide enough. Go to Extensions, AL Language Extension, and here's my code analyzers, settings.json. Well, that is for all projects that I do under my user account. So right now I have appsourcecop enabled. Well, what if I wanted to do per tenant extensions? Well, I don't want appsourcecop. I want per tenant cop. But in my experience, you don't want to have both in this same file. So what you can do is go over to Workspace Settings and AL Language Extension, and you'll notice Code and Analyzers here. Now, it does warn you, it is modified in user. So that's what this means. It means this is already modified in user, just a heads up. And I didn't realize that, what that really meant. So let's click on Edit in Settings.json here. Now, what is different here is this will edit a Workspace Settings.json or a VS Code project-specific file. Let's say I don't know what I'm doing, which is not a hard thing to say, and I'm going to choose per tenant extensions cop. Cool. I know what I'm doing. I'm enabling my per tenant extension cop here. I'm going to hit save. I'm all set, right? So let's just close this. Yep. I'm going to go into my, where is it? Customer list extension, page extension AL. I was looking for hello world. I'm going to remove my LBC. I'm going to hit save. It's not complaining. Where is it? It's not complaining anymore. Notice how customer list extension, it used to have the red squiggly saying, hey, you don't have your prefix or suffix on here. Well, wait a minute. I have appsourcecop in my settings. File, Preferences, Settings, User, Extensions, AL, where is it? Code analyzers. I have it right here, appsourcecop. Why doesn't it work? Well, it's because I also have workspace specific settings file. And thank you to Natalie on Twitter who explained why I was having this problem. She said that you have a general setting and a specific setting. So my general setting is my user setting. So that applies to all projects. But I can override that with a user setting. With a workspace setting. Let me state that again. General setting is my user settings. That applies to all projects. I can override that with a workspace setting, which is project specific. That will override my user setting. So in this case, my user setting, says use appsourcecop. But my workspace setting says use per tenant extension cop. So my understanding is my workspace setting wins. So that's why per tenant extension apparently does not require the affixes. So it is not complaining. If I remove this and save, I think what's happening is I'm saying no code analyzer should be run. Let me remove that further. Now I've removed my workspace setting, so nothing project specific. It falls back to my user code analyzer settings, and we have the warning again because my user setting says you must have the affix. So, hope that wasn't too confusing. Just be aware there's two of them. Now, I did receive an email. Let me just pull that up. So, Martin Gerritsen emailed me. He saw my botched video this morning, and he very graciously emailed me, and he says that personally, he tries to put as many settings as possible in the workspace setting and not the user setting. Makes sense. This works better when using more machines like a laptop, a VM, if you have different development environments, because the files in the workspace setting are stored in the repository with your VS Code project, your AL project. So let's say I'm working on a new VM or a new workstation, a laptop, whatever, and I pull down that code. I want those settings to come with it. I don't want to have to reconfigure my workstation every time. So that's one argument for the workspace specific settings. Now, if you say, I only work on one machine, all my settings are always the same, I'm an internal employee for a corporation and we do internal development, and we always want these settings, well, then you could have some user settings. So I guess it depends a little bit on your scenario. Do you have very stable, consistent requirements, or do those requirements vary from project to project and you're bouncing around between workstations? So another argument for the workspace setting is Natalie posted an interesting feature related to, I think it was using Docker containers for your Visual Studio Code development environments. So rather than having this heavy workstation where you install a bunch of stuff and configure it just right, that becomes your sacred workstation, why don't you just have this Docker image, Docker container, that you just spool up in order to start developing so you don't have to mess around with a workstation? Well, in that case, that could contain your user settings, but what if 10 people use it? In that case, you may want to have workspace settings. So when you download your code, you have this, what I called an ephemeral workstation. You pull it down, you set it up, you modify your code, you check it in, you wipe that workstation. In that case, you don't care about the user settings. You care about the workspace settings. So pros and cons. Just think about what makes sense for your environment. So Martin also said Control S will save and outline a file. And I think that's what I just encountered. So if I remove LBC here, when I press Control S, actually even before that, I think that's what he means, outline it. So it highlights the errors. Now, one setting I saw when doing some research is under settings, if I just go to user, for instance, say, and clear this out, I go down to extensions, AL language. So this is an option. I need to see what the reason for using it is. Background. So by default, code analysis is run in the background. But to improve performance when running code analysis on large projects. So let me just see my screen, make sure you can see that. So let's say you have this massive AL project with 200 files in there. You may not want to have code analysis run constantly on all of these files in the background. It may become slow. So you can disable that. So you can uncheck it. So, oh, the file is dirty. Save and retry. Okay, so now that I've disabled background code analysis, let me close this, go back to my page extension, and I'm going to press Control S. Why aren't we getting an error? I thought we were supposed to get an error here. Oh, I think maybe I hit a user specific. Or workspace specific. Let's go into workspace. Okay, I think this was there. So let's remove any analyzers. Go back to our user. Remove. Save. Doing Control S, but the code analyzer is not triggering. So let's try Control F5 to see if that triggers the code analysis. Okay, that did. Now, although it did trigger the code analysis rule, we aren't seeing the error here. So we're not seeing this 1 or 2 error here, which is a little strange. Let me try changing the name. Control F5. So let me go back to settings, user, extensions, AL, background code analysis. So I wonder, I don't know if there's a way to get that. This is appearing when I enable background code analysis. When I disable it, I lose that. So you then only get compile time code analysis, not like the IntelliSense squiggly line analysis. So I guess that's a trade-off. So I'm going to enable that because I kind of like that for now, especially as a beginner. I'll click here, LBC, EXT, save, and there we go. The problems are resolved. So anyway, I hope that explains the user settings.json, not to be confused with the workspace settings.json. And then there's the multi-root workspace, which I haven't discussed yet, and that I believe is if you have like multiple projects in a single VS Code workspace. So maybe you have subdirectories with multiple projects in there. And I don't know if you can have, I think you might be able to have multi-root workspace settings.jsons. I haven't looked into that yet, but just something to be aware of. So with that, I think we covered everything with Chapter 3. I hope that was helpful, and I hope this take 2, I think, was much better than my first attempt. And enjoy. Go ahead and work through Chapter 3, try those settings, and let me go back to this. get familiar with installing the AL language extension and any other extensions, doing AL Go. Just create a bunch of new projects, modifying your launch.json, downloading symbols, doing app.json. Just get familiar with that project with throwaway projects so that it's not this stressful process where you need to try to figure out what everything means. Do that a few dozen times. I'm going to create a checklist for myself, and I'm going to write a blog post on this listing all of the things you need to do to manually configure the project and get it all set up, including modifying the app.json and then modifying the settings.json files, things like that. So I hope you found that helpful. Too many buttons. Okay, hope you found that helpful and have a great day.